Settle yourself now. Let the day drift quietly behind you, and let your thoughts slow as we step into another time and place. Tonight, we begin the story of a boy who would one day be known as Muhammad Ali. But before the bright lights, before roaring crowds, and before the name was recognized around the globe, he was simply Cassius Clay, a child growing up in Louisville, Kentucky, surrounded by the steady rhythms of mid-20th century American life. If you'd like to hear more bedtime history journeys like this, please consider tapping like or subscribing. It helps more than you can imagine. I also love seeing where you're listening from, your city, country, or even just what time it is where you are. It's like weaving a global tapestry of listeners all connected through these stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe let a candle or soft lamp glow nearby. Take a deep breath. Maybe turn on the fan. Sink into your pillow. And let's begin this peaceful journey together. Louisville in the 1940s was a city alive with small, careful patterns. Streetcars rattled softly down the avenues. Church bells chimed faintly on Sunday mornings. And front porches became quiet gathering places on warm summer evenings. Families sat together, sipping sweet tea, while neighbors strolled slowly by. The air carried the hum of cicadas and the distant echo of a passing train. This was the backdrop into which young Cassius was born in January of 1942. The Clay family lived in a modest white house on Grand Avenue, with a yard that required constant sweeping to keep away the fine Kentucky dust. His father, Cassius Clay Sr., worked as a sign painter, his hands stained with bright reds, greens, and yellows. His mother, Odessa, labored as a domestic, cleaning houses for wealthier families. Their life was not rich, but it was steady, shaped by discipline, love, and hope for the future. From the time he was small, Cassius exhibited boundless energy. He darted through the neighborhood on his bicycle, often racing with friends down cracked sidewalks, the wind brushing against his face. When he paused, he drew pictures on scraps of paper with crayons or pencils, practicing an early form of observation and imagination. The ordinary pleasures of childhood, the hum of cicadas, the smell of summer air, the glow of street lamps at dusk, shaped the earliest days of a boy who would one day command the world's attention. At school, Cassius was lively and sometimes restless, though he loved words and storytelling. He often amused classmates with jokes and rhymes. Teachers occasionally found him overwhelming, but his charm and curiosity shone through. Even then, the seeds of expression, wit, and confidence were quietly growing. Evenings at home were a blend of calm and routine. Breakfasts were simple, eggs, toast, and grits. And evenings brought the soft music of the radio, playing jazz or the evening news. Odessa would hum hymns as she prepared meals, her voice drifting through the house as shadows stretched across the quiet streets. Outside, the occasional train whistle and the gentle rustle of leaves marked the passage of time, embedding rhythm into the everyday life of young Cassius. Life in Louisville was not without its challenges. Segregation defined many spaces. Schools, restaurants, and public services were divided along racial lines. Cassius grew up aware of limits imposed upon him by society, yet within his home and his community, he found strength, faith, and guidance. Odessa instilled in him the importance of respect, self-discipline, and belief in one's abilities, lessons that would quietly shape his future. When Cassius was 12, a seemingly small event would guide him toward his future. His cherished bicycle, a bright red frame that had carried him through countless afternoons, was stolen. Frustrated and almost in tears, he wanted to confront the thief. Instead, he was directed to a local police officer, Joe Martin, who also ran a small boxing gym in the basement of a nearby building. Martin listened patiently and then offered a gentle suggestion. Before fighting anyone, perhaps Cassius should learn how to box. The boy stepped into a new world. The gym smelled faintly of leather and sweat, lit by fluorescent lights that buzzed softly overhead. Wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the soft swish of a jump rope marked the steady rhythm of training. Cassius slipped on his first pair of gloves. They felt heavy and awkward, but in their weight, there was a strange comfort, a structure, a rhythm, a challenge that drew him in. At first his punches were clumsy, his stance unsteady, yet he returned day after day, learning the basic movements, jabs, footwork, guarding, the subtle sway of the body. Outside the gym, he shadowboxed in his room, threw playful punches at friends, and practiced endlessly, blending training seamlessly into the patterns of daily life. By early adolescence, Cassius began to stand out. Joe Martin noticed his discipline, speed, and natural charm. The boy who had stormed into the gym over a stolen bicycle was now learning patience, rhythm, and control. Evenings were often quiet walks home under dim street lamps, gloves slung over his shoulder, the streets of Louisville empty and calm. Each step was ordinary, yet each carried him closer to a life that would one day reach across the globe. In these early years, there were no headlines or accolades, only the small, steady unfolding of daily life. Family dinners, neighborhood games, school days, and soft summer evenings shaped a boy whose dreams were quietly taking root. As we leave this chapter, imagine him pedaling along the streets, laughing with friends, drawing in the sunlight and stepping into a gym for the first time. A boy named Cassius, beginning a journey that would eventually make him a legend. Early life of Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay. In the stillness of a Kentucky morning, long before the name Muhammad Ali echoed around the world, a boy named Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. came into being. It was January 17, 1942, and the town of Louisville, with its wide river, brick streets, and modest neighborhoods, was wrapped in the quiet uncertainty of a world at war. The Clay family's home stood in a working-class district, unassuming and humble, but within it was a child who would one day grow into a presence larger than life itself. Louisville at that time was a city divided by custom and by law. Segregation shaped the lives of its black residents, dictating where they could live, which restaurants they could eat in, and how they were expected to carry themselves in public. Yet within these restrictions, families like the Clays created their own havens of warmth, tradition, and resilience. His father, Cassius Marcellus Clay Sr., earned a living as a sign painter, crafting letters and colors onto storefronts, while his mother, Odessa Grady Clay, worked as a domestic helper, her gentle voice and steadfast nature holding the family together. They raised their son not in wealth but in faith, routine, and the kind of hard work that builds character even when resources are scarce. The boy Cassius was curious, playful, and restless, his energy often spilling beyond the narrow lines of polite behavior expected in mid-century Louisville. Neighbors recalled how he raced down the sidewalks with boundless enthusiasm, how his laughter carried across the porches of summer evenings. He was a child who noticed everything: the movements of people, the sounds of the streetcars, the shifting tones in his parents' conversations. The world around him impressed itself deeply upon his young mind, planting seeds that would later blossom into an almost theatrical awareness of performance, audience, and presence. When Cassius was 12 years old, an event occurred that would set him firmly on the path that would shape his destiny. His prized red and white bicycle, a simple Schwinn given to him as a treasure of boyhood freedom, was stolen. In his anger and confusion, he sought out a police officer named Joe Martin, who also happened to train young boxers at a local gym. Cassius declared that he wanted to find the thief and, in his own fiery words, whoop him. Martin, with the patience of an adult who had seen youthful energy turn dangerous, suggested instead that if Cassius really wanted to fight, he should learn how to box properly. The young boy's eyes lit up at the thought. Boxing offered discipline, a place to channel his anger, and perhaps a way to craft an identity beyond the boundaries that Louisville seemed to place upon him. Under Martin's guidance, Cassius entered the gym, his small fists wrapped for the first time, his stance awkward but eager. The smell of sweat, leather, and liniment filled the air, the rhythmic sound of gloves striking heavy bags echoing around him. These were not the streets of his neighborhood, but a new world with rules, structure, and the promise of mastery. In those early sessions, Cassius showed something beyond natural talent. He was quick, yes, but more than that, he was determined. He had an instinct for rhythm, moving with an agility that surprised his trainers. He listened, he adapted, and even when clumsy, he never doubted himself. That confidence, so present in his later years, was already taking root. The boy who had once shouted about punishing a thief was beginning to understand that the real opponent was not some stranger, but his own limitations, his own fear, and his own impatience. Life outside the gym, however, was not always easy. Louisville's divisions remained sharp. Cassius experienced firsthand the indignities of segregation, from being turned away at lunch counters to feeling the sting of insults hurled carelessly by strangers. These experiences carved deep impressions in him. They were not forgotten, nor did they fade into the background. Instead, they became fuel, sometimes smoldering quietly, other times igniting into words and actions that would later define him. The world told him that his worth was limited, but he refused to accept such a definition. He carried himself with an inner flame that others often mistook for arrogance, though it was, in truth, a determination to never bow, never yield, and never let anyone else write the story of who he was. The Clay family's home life offered both challenges and stability. His father, while creative and hardworking, was known to struggle with drink, and moments of unrest were not unfamiliar. Yet his mother's steady hand, her sense of faith and fairness, gave Cassius a foundation that balanced those storms. She instilled in him the idea that one's character mattered more than circumstance, that dignity must be carried even in the face of injustice. Odessa's influence stayed with him throughout his life. Her calm encouragement was often recalled in his later reflections when the chaos of fame surrounded him. By the age of 14, Cassius was competing in amateur bouts. The small crowds, the ring lights, and the cheers gave him a taste of the stage he would one day command on a global scale. He learned quickly that victory was not only in the fists, but in the mind, that anticipation, confidence, and composure were as vital as punches thrown. He began to develop his own style, moving lightly on his feet, speaking boldly before matches, and crafting a persona that set him apart from the more reserved fighters of the day. Even then, the seeds of his later bravado, his rhymes, his self-assured declarations were being sown. As the years passed, Cassius grew taller, stronger, and sharper. His amateur career flourished, and by the time he was a late teenager, he had built a reputation as a rising star in the local boxing community. Louisville might not yet have known it, but within its borders, in a modest neighborhood, and under the roof of a family like many others, was a young man destined to become an icon. The boy who had once mourned a stolen bicycle was becoming something greater, an athlete, a performer, and slowly but surely, a symbol of pride for those who needed to see one of their own rise above the weight of prejudice and circumstance. His path was not yet certain, but its direction was unmistakable. And so, in the early 1950s, with gloves in his hands and purpose in his heart, Cassius Clay stepped into the world. Not yet the man history would call the greatest, but already walking the road toward it. The city of Louisville could scarcely imagine the legacy he would carry forth, the battles he would wage both in and out of the ring, or the way his voice would one day speak to people far beyond the borders of Kentucky. But the journey had begun, and the boy was ready. Discovering the ring, Muhammad Ali's first steps into boxing. The story of Muhammad Ali cannot be told without tracing back to the very first time he laced up gloves, the very first time a boy named Cassius Clay stood in front of a punching bag and felt that curious rhythm between fist and leather. It is in these quieter beginnings, tucked away in the heart of Louisville, Kentucky, that the foundations of his legend began. Picture the city as it was in the late 1940s and early 1950s, a place where the Ohio River carried both industry and segregation in equal measure. Streetcars rattled across tracks, grocery store windows reflected the dusty sunshine, and on sidewalks, children chased each other in games that required no equipment beyond imagination. Cassius Clay was one of those children, wiry, fast, bursting with a restless energy that seemed too big for any one neighborhood to hold. That energy often spilled over into mischief. He was not a boy who sat quietly, He was a boy who wanted the world to notice him. And yet, destiny sometimes emerges from the most ordinary of moments. For Ali, it began not in a grand arena, but with a stolen bicycle. Cassius was just 12 when his red and white Schwinn bike disappeared outside a community center. Angry and determined to get it back, he stormed into the basement of the building where a policeman named Joe Martin ran a small boxing program. Cassius declared he wanted to whoop the thief, to settle things with his fists. Joe Martin, calm and amused, told him he'd better learn how to fight properly before he tried to challenge anyone. That offhand remark opened a doorway. The young Clay returned, curious, and stepped into the world of boxing. What began as a reaction to a stolen bike soon became the central current of his life. The training space was modest: cement floors, heavy bags hanging from beams, the faint smell of leather and sweat lingering in the air. Under the fluorescent lights, Cassius moved awkwardly at first, his skinny frame not yet knowing how to balance grace with power. But there was a spark. Joe Martin saw it almost immediately. The boy had unusual speed, not just for his age, but for any boxer. His hands snapped out like rubber bands, his feet shuffled lightly as though he were dancing rather than fighting. In those early weeks, Martin taught him fundamentals: how to hold his hands, how to jab, how to guard his chin. Cassius listened intently, though always with a touch of playful bravado. He was not shy about telling people he would be great, even before he had any reason to think so. That confidence, which others sometimes dismissed as arrogance, was simply the foundation of his belief system. It was as though, deep down, he already knew who he was destined to be. The city outside went on with its routines: church bells chiming on Sunday mornings, trains rumbling across the river bridges, families gathering for supper as the summer heat pressed in. And while all of that life continued, Cassius Clay spent more and more evenings inside the gym, hitting bags, skipping rope, learning to harness his restless energy into rhythm. The boy who once chased after a bicycle thief was now chasing something far greater: mastery of his own potential. Time passed and the results became clear. Cassius began entering amateur bouts, first local, then regional. His early matches often ended in surprise for his opponents, who underestimated the slim, fast-moving teenager. He was not the strongest, but he was the quickest. And in boxing, quickness is often the difference between victory and defeat. By 1954, he had built a small reputation in Kentucky. His family, though modest in their means, began to see that this passion was more than a hobby. His father, Cassius Clay Sr., who painted billboards and signs, encouraged him in his ambitions, though he sometimes worried about his son's cocky demeanor. His mother, Odessa, prayed for his safety each time he stepped into the ring. One of the first turning points came when Cassius appeared on a local television program run by Joe Martin called Tomorrow's Champions. Viewers across Louisville saw a young man full of energy and personality, declaring in his high-pitched voice that he was going to be the greatest boxer who ever lived. The boldness of the claim, coming from someone so young, startled some and amused others. Yet behind the theatrics there was genuine skill developing. The boy grew into a teenager, and with each passing year, his reputation expanded. He traveled to tournaments in different states, collecting wins, learning from the occasional loss and refining his style. His jab became sharper, his footwork lighter, and his confidence louder. By the time he was 16, he was already well known in amateur boxing circles. Louisville itself became both the anchor and the springboard for his dreams. In a segregated America, opportunities were not equally distributed, and Cassius was keenly aware of that. Yet, in the ring, none of that seemed to matter. Boxing, at least in those amateur bouts, was a meritocracy. The faster, smarter, and more skilled fighter won. And Cassius Clay loved to win. As he trained, the city nights wrapped around him. Cicadas buzzing in summer darkness, the smell of barbecue drifting through neighborhoods, neon signs flickering along downtown streets. Cassius carried all of it inside him: the rhythms, the voices, the struggle, and the hope. These were not yet the days of Muhammad Ali, the world champion. These were the days of a boy finding his place. of a teenager discovering that his destiny was not in the ordinary paths of school or labor, but in the extraordinary space of the boxing ring. It is often said that champions are not born, but made. For Cassius Clay, the making began here, in the dim basement gyms of Louisville, in the laughter of his family's small home, in the stolen bicycle that set him on an unexpected path. He was not yet the man who would change the sport forever, but he was becoming him, quietly, steadily, with each punch thrown into the humid Kentucky air. And so, the boy trained, as days turned into months and months into years, until his amateur record gleamed with victories, and his future pointed toward the grandest stage of all, the Olympics. The gentle hum of Louisville life surrounded him, but inside Cassius Clay's heart, something larger was stirring, something that would carry him from local gyms to the world stage and eventually to immortality.
The Olympic Dream, Rome, 1960. The journey of Cassius Clay from the streets of Louisville to the world stage is one of those stories that feels almost mythical, and yet it unfolded in the ordinary rhythms of life. One day, one training session, one bout at a time. By the time he was 18, Cassius had already compiled an impressive amateur record. His fast hands, dancing footwork, and unshakable confidence made him stand out in gyms across America. Coaches, promoters, and other fighters noticed something unusual in the young man from Kentucky. He wasn't just another teenager throwing punches. He was a comet streaking across the amateur scene. And now, the stage was set for the greatest amateur boxing event of all, the 1960 Summer Olympics in Rome. Preparing for the Games, in the late 1950s, the Cold War simmered beneath everything. International competitions were more than just sport. They were symbolic battles between ideologies. To wear the American uniform was not simply to represent oneself, but to carry the pride of a nation into the ring. For Cassius Clay, it was also the chance to prove to the world, and perhaps to himself, that his bold declarations of greatness were not empty words. Training for the Olympics was grueling. Cassius sharpened every skill. His jab became as fast as a flickering light bulb, his footwork lighter than a whisper across the canvas. He trained not just in boxing gyms but also running across Louisville's streets, shadow boxing in the heat, skipping rope under the glow of street lamps. Yet behind the sweat and effort lay the same spark that had guided him since the day his bicycle was stolen. He believed in his destiny. He spoke of it often, telling anyone who would listen that he was going to win gold. His teammates sometimes rolled their eyes at his confidence, but deep down, they knew he might just be right. Arriving in Rome, August 1960, the city of Rome hummed with history and excitement. Ancient ruins stood beside bustling piazzas, fountains gushed in the heat of the summer sun, and athletes from around the world filled the Olympic Village with chatter in dozens of languages. For an 18-year-old from Louisville, stepping into this ancient city was like walking into a dream. Cassius Clay arrived in Rome wearing his trademark smile, wide and full of energy. He charmed fellow athletes, posed for photos, and filled the air with his declarations of victory. While others carried quiet determination, Cassius carried joy, as though the Olympics were not a pressure-filled trial but an adventure written just for him.
Yet he was also serious. He studied his opponents carefully, knowing that each bout brought him closer to his dream. In the light heavyweight division, he faced tough fighters from around the world, men older, stronger, and more seasoned. But Cassius had something unique: speed, reflexes, and the ability to predict an opponent's moves before they happened. The fights the Olympic tournament demanded both endurance and brilliance. Bout after bout, Cassius Clay dazzled. His opponent swung heavy punches, but he slipped them with head movement and nimble footwork. He struck back with crisp combinations, scoring points and demoralizing his rivals. The judges, the crowd, and even his competitors began to see that there was something different about this young man. In the quarterfinal, he faced Gennady Shatkov, a strong and experienced boxer from the Soviet Union. The Cold War tensions made the fight symbolic, America versus Russia, and the pressure was immense. But Cassius, unshaken, danced around his opponent and won with speed and precision. It was not just victory, it was a statement. The semi-final brought him against Australia's Tony Madigan. Cassius controlled the ring again, jabbing, moving, smiling even as he fought. He advanced to the final, where he would face the toughest opponent of all, Zbigniew Pietrykowski of Poland, a three-time European champion and a fighter with overwhelming strength. The gold medal bout took place under the hot lights of the Olympic arena. The crowd filled every seat, their voices echoing across the ancient city. For 3 rounds, Cassius fought not just with his fists but with his belief. Pietrykowski landed heavy punches, but Cassius answered with speed, rhythm, and a heart that refused to yield. By the final bell, the judges declared Cassius Clay the winner. At just 18 years old, he had achieved what he had long proclaimed. He was the best in the world. The gold medal was draped around his neck, gleaming under the Roman sun. The boy from Louisville had now become an Olympic champion. Rome's impact. The Olympics transformed Cassius Clay. The medal was more than medal. It was a symbol of legitimacy. No longer was he merely a brash teenager boasting about his future. He was now a proven victor on the grandest stage. But beyond the boxing, Rome left a mark on him. The city's art, history, and grandeur opened his eyes to a wider world. He dined with athletes from across continents, discovered new cultures, and realized that his name was beginning to echo far beyond Kentucky. Wherever he walked in the Olympic Village, people stopped him, drawn not just to his talent, but to his personality, the laughter, the words, the charm. For Cassius, the trip to Rome was more than just competition. It was an awakening. He saw that boxing could be a gateway to the world, a stage where he could not only win fights, but also tell a story. His story. Returning home. When Cassius Clay returned to Louisville with his gold medal, he was celebrated as a local hero. Crowds greeted him, friends congratulated him, and his family glowed with pride. For a time, he carried the medal everywhere, showing it off, sleeping with it near his pillow, as if afraid the dream might vanish if he let it out of sight. But the glow of triumph also revealed the deeper truths of his country. Despite being an Olympic champion, Cassius was still a young black man in a segregated America. There were restaurants he could not enter, neighborhoods he could not live in, and barriers that no medal could erase. The contradiction cut deep. He had fought for his country, won gold, and returned to find himself still treated as less than equal. In later years, he would speak of these moments with clarity and passion. Some accounts suggest he once threw his medal into the Ohio River after being denied service at a segregated restaurant. Whether the story is literal or symbolic, the feeling was real. The pain of realizing that victory abroad did not guarantee respect at home. Seeds of the future. Still, the Rome Olympics had launched him forward. With his gold medal and growing fame, Cassius Clay now turned his eyes to the professional ranks. His amateur record stood as one of the best of his generation. The foundation was laid, and the world was beginning to whisper his name. What the people did not yet know, however, was that this young Olympic champion would soon evolve into more than a boxer. His fists would bring him fame, but his voice, his courage, and his convictions would make him immortal. For now, though, he was still Cassius Clay, smiling, fast-talking, gold medal in hand, dreaming of bigger fights, larger crowds, and the unshakable belief that destiny was calling him onward. And destiny, as always, was listening. Rising star in the professional ring. The gold medal from Rome was more than just a triumph. It was a passport. Cassius Clay returned to America with the weight of victory and the glow of youth, ready to take the next step in his journey. The amateur world had given him its highest honor, but Cassius was already looking beyond. He wanted more glory, more stage, more recognition. And for that, he needed to turn professional. The professional leap. In October 1960, only weeks after returning from Rome, Cassius Clay made his professional debut. The venue was in his hometown of Louisville, where fans and family packed in to watch the young champion step into a new world. His opponent, Tony Hunsaker, was no easy mark. A police chief by profession and a seasoned fighter in the ring, Hunsaker was older, stronger, and determined not to be embarrassed by a teenager. But Cassius was already Cassius, fast, confident, dazzling. He danced, jabbed, and peppered Hunsaker with punches that seemed to come from every angle. The fight went 6 rounds, but the decision was unanimous. Cassius Clay was victorious. Louisville roared in pride. From that moment, the professional boxing world had taken notice. Here was a teenager with a gold medal, a brash mouth, lightning fists, and the charisma to fill a room before he even opened his gloves. Building a record. The next 2 years were a whirlwind. Cassius fought often, sometimes every month, building his professional record. He beat journeymen, prospects, and veterans alike, each victory sharpening his skills and raising his profile. By the end of 1962, he had amassed a string of wins, many by knockout, and his confidence grew louder with each triumph. What set him apart was not just his talent, but his voice. Unlike most fighters of his time, who spoke little outside the ring, Cassius turned every weigh-in, every press conference, and every post-fight interview into theater. He predicted the round in which he would knock out his opponent, and often he was right. He crafted rhymes, taunted rivals, and played to the cameras with a natural charisma. "Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee," he declared, a phrase that would follow him for the rest of his life. To some, his confidence was refreshing, entertaining, even inspiring. To others, it was arrogance, a young man who talked too much. But whether loved or hated, he was never ignored. And that, Cassius knew, was exactly the point. The Louisville sponsorship group behind the bright lights and headlines. There was also strategy. When Cassius turned professional, he did not sign with a single promoter. Instead, a group of wealthy white businessmen from Louisville formed a syndicate known as the Louisville Sponsoring Group, investing in his career and managing his finances. It was an unusual arrangement, one that gave Cassius steady support but also tied him to men who did not fully understand the young fighter's mind or spirit. For now, the arrangement worked. The sponsors provided money, stability, and connections. Cassius provided victories, fame, and the promise of something bigger. Yet, in time, the relationship would show its limits. Facing tougher tests. By 1962, Cassius was no longer just a young prospect. He was climbing the rankings, facing tougher opponents who wanted to humble the loudmouth from Louisville. Fighters like Sonny Banks, who knocked him down briefly before Cassius roared back to win, taught him valuable lessons about resilience. Henry Cooper, a tough British fighter, floored him with a left hook in 1963, only for Cassius to rise, recover, and win the fight. Each test revealed flaws, but also his ability to adapt. Cassius was not invincible, but he was unbreakable. His speed, reflexes, and courage carried him through moments that might have ended other careers. A showman in the ring. What made him magnetic was the way he turned fights into theater. He entered the ring with bravado, sometimes mocking his opponents, sometimes dazzling with his movement. Fans came not just to see him fight, but to see what he would say or do next. He called himself the greatest before he had even won a title. He labeled opponents with nicknames, some playful, some cutting, that stuck in the public mind. He understood, even as a young man, that boxing was as much about storytelling as it was about punching. The path towards Sonny Liston. By late 1963, Cassius Clay's record stood at 19 wins, no losses. He had defeated Doug Jones, Archie Moore, a legendary former champion, and other respected names. The momentum was undeniable. The boxing world, skeptical at first, was now forced to admit that the teenager from Louisville was a serious contender. And waiting at the top of the mountain was Sonny Liston. Liston was everything Cassius was not. Dark, brooding, terrifying. His fists were like sledgehammers, his aura filled with menace. He was the reigning heavyweight champion of the world, and most believed he was unbeatable. Writers compared him to a wrecking ball, a man who destroyed opponents with frightening ease. For Cassius Clay, this was the moment he had been preparing for. All the talk, all the rhymes, all the declarations of greatness were leading to this inevitable clash. He was not just chasing a title, he was chasing history. The persona takes shape. Outside the ring, Cassius continued to shape his public persona. He was flamboyant, confident, and unafraid of attention. He bought flashy cars, wore sharp clothes, and carried himself with a swagger that reflected both pride and ambition. But beneath the showmanship was still the boy from Louisville, the young man who prayed before his fights, who remained close to his mother and father, and who carried deep thoughts about life, race, and justice. The seeds of the man he would later become, the man who would call himself Muhammad Ali, were already there, waiting to bloom. Massachusetts. As Cassius Clay's star rose, America watched with fascination. Television brought his fights into living rooms. Newspapers carried his quotes across the country. He was not yet the most famous athlete in the world, but he was on his way. And whether one loved him or hated him, one thing was certain: nobody could look away. The stage was set. Cassius Clay, the brash young Olympic champion, had marched through the professional ranks with speed, style, and swagger. He was undefeated, unbowed, and unafraid. The only mountain left to climb was Sonny Liston, the feared heavyweight champion. The boxing world braced itself. It would be youth versus power, speed versus strength, light versus darkness. And Cassius Clay, smiling as always, declared to anyone who would listen, "I'm going to shock the world." The Liston fight, shocking the world. By early 1964, Cassius Clay had built himself into a storm. 19 wins, no defeats, a voice that shook the quiet rules of boxing, and a swagger that demanded attention. But now, all of the noise, all of the poetry, all of the bravado, led to one single point: Sonny Liston. The fight was set for February 25, 1964, in Miami Beach, Florida. The world leaned forward. For some, this was simply another heavyweight title fight. For others, it was theater of the highest order, a battle of two men who could not be more different. The shadow of Sonny Liston. Sonny Liston was a man who carried fear as if it were armor. His story was carved from poverty and violence. He had risen from a harsh childhood and time in prison to become one of the most feared heavyweight champions in history. His fists were heavy, his jab a weapon, his presence terrifying. Sports writers described him as an unstoppable force. His face, hard, impassive, gave little away. His aura spoke for him. You didn't beat Sonny Liston. You survived him. In 1962, he had destroyed Floyd Patterson, the reigning champion, in a matter of minutes. Then, he did it again in the rematch. Each time, Patterson barely landed a punch before Liston flattened him. Most experts believed Cassius Clay would be next on that list. They said the brash, loudmouthed 22-year-old would finally meet reality. But Clay, as always, refused to play the role others wrote for him. The theater of hype. From the moment the fight was announced, Clay turned the build-up into a one-man show. He mocked Liston mercilessly. He called him a bear. He rhymed predictions. He shouted at reporters that Liston was too slow, too ugly, too old to beat him. "I'm the greatest," he declared. "I shook up the world when I won Olympic gold, and now I'm going to shake it up again. If Sonny Liston even dreams of beating me, he better wake up and apologize." He drove around Miami in a bus with a loudspeaker, chanting insults at Liston. He would show up at Liston's training camp, shouting across the fence like a taunting schoolboy. The press ate it up. To some, it was entertainment. To others, it was insanity. They believed Clay had gone too far. This wasn't just a tough fight. This was suicide. But Cassius Clay was never just fighting with his fists. He was fighting with his mind. He wanted Sonny Liston angry, uncomfortable, distracted. He wanted to turn the champion into something less than invincible. A man. The night of the fight, the Miami Beach Convention Hall was packed with celebrities, reporters, and fans. The air was thick with smoke and anticipation. Bookmakers had made Liston a heavy favorite, some refusing even to take bets on Clay. To them, the fight was a foregone conclusion. As Clay entered the ring, he was electric. He danced, he shouted, he played to the crowd. Liston entered like a machine, stone-faced, fists like hammers. The bell rang. The fight begins. Round 1 set the tone. Cassius Clay did not stand and trade punches with Liston. Instead, he danced. He moved with speed unseen in a heavyweight. He circled the ring, firing jabs that landed with precision. Liston swung, but the punches sliced empty air. The crowd gasped. Clay was not being crushed. He was shining. By round 3, Clay's confidence exploded. He lowered his hands, leaned away from punches, and shouted at Liston, "You big ugly bear, you can't hit me." The words echoed as he peppered Liston with shots, each jab a needle, each right hand a flash. But then, in round 4, disaster struck. Something burned in Clay's eyes. He blinked, winced, tried to wipe his face. Panic set in. He couldn't see. Theories swirled later. Maybe Liston's gloves had ointment on them, maybe it was an accident. But in that moment, Cassius Clay was blind in the ring with Sonny Liston. He stumbled back to his corner. "Cut the gloves off," he cried to his trainer, Angelo Dundee. "I can't see," Dundee refused. "No way, kid. Get out there, run, just run." So Clay ran. He circled the ring, flailing, dodging punches he could barely see. Liston lunged, but he was too slow, too surprised. And slowly, miraculously, the burning faded. Clay's vision returned. By round 6, Cassius Clay was alive again. His fists lit the air. His jabs snapped Liston's head back. His feet floated across the canvas. The young challenger had regained control. The shock of the 7th. When the bell rang for the 7th round, Sonny Liston did not rise. His shoulder, he claimed, had given out. But others believed it was more than that. They said Liston, the fearsome destroyer, had quit. He had been beaten by speed, by youth, by brilliance. Cassius Clay leapt into the air, his voice roaring across the hall. "I shook up the world! I shook up the world!" At just 22 years old, he was the new heavyweight champion of the world. The aftermath. The boxing world was stunned. The experts had been wrong. The unbeatable Liston had been defeated. And not just defeated, humiliated. A loudmouth kid had danced around him, taunted him, and forced him to surrender. Clay stood in the center of the storm, glowing. Reporters crowded, cameras flashed. The new champion shouted, "I am the greatest. I'm the prettiest. I shook up the world." It was a coronation. Cassius Clay had arrived, not just as champion, but as a force of nature. More than a title. But the fight meant more than boxing. For Black America, Cassius Clay's victory was a beacon. He was young, proud, unapologetic, unafraid to show his brilliance in a world that often demanded silence. For others, his antics made him dangerous, threatening even. They saw him as too loud, too brash, too ungrateful. The lines of love and hate were drawn deeper. What nobody could deny was this: Cassius Clay had changed boxing forever. The old world of silent, humble champions had ended. A new era had begun, one filled with rhythm, with fire, with defiance. The dawn of Ali. Even as he celebrated, deeper changes were stirring. Just days after his victory, Cassius Clay would make another announcement, one that would echo even louder than the fight itself. But for that night in Miami, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the voice of a 22-year-old champion, standing tall in the smoke and lights, shouting to the world, "I shook up the world." From Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali. The morning after Cassius Clay shocked the world by defeating Sonny Liston in Miami, the world buzzed with disbelief. A 22-year-old challenger had toppled the most feared man in boxing. Yet, before the press, before the public could even settle into this new reality, Clay dropped a revelation that would transform not only his identity, but the identity of an entire generation. The story of Muhammad Ali begins here. The quiet rumors. Even before the Liston fight, whispers surrounded Clay. He had been seen in the company of Malcolm X, one of the most outspoken leaders of the Nation of Islam. The nation was viewed with suspicion by mainstream America. It was militant, it was separatist, it rejected integration, and preached that black people should define themselves apart from the white power structure. To some it was dangerous. To others, it was empowering. And now, their newest disciple was the loudest voice in sports. Cassius Clay's friendship with Malcolm X went deeper than many realized. Malcolm saw in Clay not just a fighter, but a symbol, a young black man unafraid to speak, unafraid to shine. To Clay, Malcolm was a teacher, a mentor who gave him purpose beyond the ring. The announcement. 2 days after becoming heavyweight champion, Cassius Clay stood before microphones and delivered the news. "I am a member of the Nation of Islam." Reporters froze. The headlines flashed. The most famous athlete in America was aligning himself with one of the most controversial movements of the day. And then came the final transformation. "Elijah Muhammad, leader of the Nation of Islam, has given me a new name," he declared. "I am no longer Cassius Clay. Clay was my slave name. I am Muhammad Ali." It was thunder. It was defiance. It was liberation. The world reactions came swift and sharp. To many white Americans, Ali's embrace of the Nation of Islam was shocking, even unforgivable. They accused him of turning his back on his country. Some called him ungrateful, others dangerous. Even the press refused at first to acknowledge his new identity. Newspapers stubbornly printed Cassius Clay, as if the name Ali had no legitimacy. Broadcasters stumbled, some deliberately sneered, others ignoring the change altogether. But Ali did not bend. "I am Muhammad Ali," he repeated again and again. "If you don't say my name, you don't know me." For Black America, his declaration was polarizing. Some celebrated him as a hero, a man unafraid to break chains. Others, uneasy with the radical image of the Nation of Islam, worried he was stepping into dangerous waters. Still, for young black men and women across the country, Ali's stance was a jolt of pride. He was unapologetic, loud, fearless, a mirror to their own dreams of dignity. Malcolm X and the champion. At the heart of Ali's transformation was Malcolm X. The two shared meals, traveled together, and laughed like brothers. Malcolm urged him to see boxing not just as sport, but as platform, a stage from which he could speak truth. But the Nation of Islam was fractured. Its leader, Elijah Muhammad, grew wary of Malcolm's rising influence. Tensions between the two men deepened, and Ali was caught in the middle. Malcolm saw Ali as his closest ally, but Elijah Muhammad demanded loyalty to the nation above all else. In the end, Ali chose Elijah. The split broke Malcolm's heart. The bond between teacher and student was severed, and Ali walked with the nation while Malcolm walked away. Looking back years later, Ali admitted it was one of his deepest regrets. In 1965, when Malcolm X was assassinated, Ali mourned privately, carrying guilt for the rest of his life. The making of a symbol. The transformation from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali was not just about religion, it was about identity. It was about rejecting a history of silence. It was about a black man telling the world, "I will name myself. I will define myself. I will not be controlled." Every fight, every word, every appearance now carried more weight. Ali was no longer just an athlete. He was a cultural earthquake. To some, he was arrogant. To others, he was inspiring. But no one could ignore him. The ring reflects the change. In the months after claiming his new name, Ali defended his championship. The brashness remained, but there was also a newfound seriousness. He trained harder, spoke sharper, carried himself with a sense of mission. When he stepped into the ring, he wasn't just fighting opponents. He was fighting stereotypes, fighting doubt, fighting the very structure of a sport that had long demanded its black champions stay silent. And he was brilliant. He danced with speed no heavyweight could match. He taunted, he laughed, he struck with lightning jabs. The crowd would boo, then gasp, then cheer, pulled into the storm of Ali's charisma. The name Battle. The insistence on his name became symbolic of everything Ali stood for. Opponents, reporters, even rivals used it as a weapon. Sonny Liston sneered Cassius Clay in interviews, refusing to acknowledge Ali's transformation. But Ali doubled down. He would scream at journalists, "What's my name?" In one famous fight against Ernie Terrell, who refused to call him Muhammad Ali, Ali punished him for 15 rounds, shouting with each blow, "What's my name? What's my name?" It was brutal. It was personal. It was Ali demanding respect, not just for himself, but for the dignity of every man who refused to be erased. America in flames. The timing of Ali's transformation magnified its impact. The 1960s were a decade of upheaval. Civil rights marches filled the streets. Martin Luther King Jr. preached nonviolence and integration. Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam demanded separation and self-determination. Ali stood at the intersection of sports and revolution. He became both lightning rod and lighthouse. For young people, he was the symbol of rebellion. For the establishment, he was a threat. And yet his smile, his wit, his poetry kept him magnetic. Even his critics could not turn away. The larger battle. By 1966, the storm grew darker. The Vietnam War was escalating. The draft loomed. Soon, Muhammad Ali would face a choice that would test not only his name but his very soul. But before that moment, before the draft, before exile, the transformation itself stood as one of the boldest acts in sports history. Cassius Clay had been a boy chasing gold medals, shouting in rhymes, dancing in rings. Muhammad Ali was a man, a fighter, and a symbol who demanded the world see him on his own terms. And the world would never be the same. Ali versus the draft, standing against war. The year was 1966. Muhammad Ali was 24 years old, heavyweight champion of the world, undefeated, adored by some, despised by others. His fists had made him a global star, but it was his voice, bold, defiant, and unwavering, that now threatened to strip it all away. The Vietnam War loomed over America. Each month, more young men were being drafted to fight in a war many didn't understand, a war many didn't believe in. For Black Americans, the contradiction was painful. They were asked to fight and die for freedoms abroad that they themselves were denied at home. And into this storm stepped Muhammad Ali. The letter in the mail. Ali's draft status had shifted. At first, he was classified as unfit for service due to low test scores. He had famously quipped, "I said I was the greatest, not the smartest." But when the war escalated, the rules changed. The U.S. Army lowered the standards, and suddenly Muhammad Ali was deemed eligible for the draft. When the letter arrived, Ali's choice was clear. He would not go. His reasons were deeply rooted, in faith, in principle, in identity. As a member of the Nation of Islam, he believed he could not, in good conscience, fight in a war for a country that oppressed his people. He put it bluntly, "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me no. The statement was shocking, powerful, unforgettable. It sliced through the American conscience like a blade. The backlash. The reaction was immediate and furious. Newspapers branded him a coward. Politicians called him unpatriotic. Boxing commissions threatened to strip him of his title. Ali, once seen as a loudmouth but lovable champion, was suddenly cast as a villain. Crowds booed him. Endorsements disappeared. Even fellow athletes distanced themselves. But Ali did not waver. "My conscience won't let me go shoot my brother or some darker people, or some poor hungry people in the mud for big powerful America. And shoot them for what? They never lynched me. They didn't put no dogs on me. They didn't rob me of my nationality. They didn't rape and kill my mother and father. Shoot them for what?" He stood firm. The louder the criticism grew, the calmer his defiance became. Stripped of glory. In April 1967, Ali's refusal became official. When called to step forward and accept induction into the U.S. Army, he stood still. 3 times his name was called. 3 times he did not move. He was arrested on the spot. Convicted of draft evasion, sentenced to 5 years in prison and fined $10,000, was exiled from the sport he had conquered. His title from 1967 to 1970, the prime years of a fighter's career, Ali was banned from boxing. No arenas would host him, no commission would sanction him. The silence of the ring was deafening. Alone in the storm, Ali found himself at a crossroads. Many believed his career was finished, that he would fade into obscurity, remembered as a fallen star who chose politics over glory. But Ali refused to disappear. If the ring was taken from him, he would take his fight to the stage. He traveled across the country, speaking at colleges and community centers. Crowds gathered, not just to hear a champion, but to witness a man who risked everything for principle. He spoke about injustice, about faith, about war, about dignity. His voice carried a rhythm, a poetry, the same cadence that once filled arenas now filled lecture halls. Young people especially rallied to his side. For them, Ali was proof that courage meant more than medals, that greatness meant sacrifice. The divide in America. The Vietnam War divided America like few issues before. Protesters marched in the streets. Soldiers returned in coffins. Television screens showed jungles burning, villages destroyed, young men broken. Ali's stand placed him at the center of this conflict. To his supporters, he was a hero, a truth-teller who exposed the hypocrisy of war. To his critics, he was a traitor, a coward who betrayed his country. But Ali didn't bend to either side. He stood with his faith, with his conscience. "I'm just trying to be free," he said simply. The toll of exile. The cost was immense. Without boxing, Ali struggled financially. Lawsuits drained him, friends abandoned him. The press mocked him, portraying him as bitter, arrogant, finished. But Ali endured. He trained in quiet gyms, shadowboxed in mirrors, stayed ready for a return that seemed impossible. In private moments, he admitted the pain. He missed the roar of the crowd, the thrill of combat, the artistry of the ring. Yet he never let the world see despair. He carried himself with grace, with humor, with unwavering belief that history would prove him right. The courtroom battle. Ali's legal case moved slowly through the system. He appealed his conviction, but the process dragged on for years. The weight of prison hung over him constantly. Still, he refused to compromise. Offers came. Fight in exhibitions overseas, apologize publicly, soften his stance. Ali rejected them all. His fight was not just for himself, it was for principle.
If I thought the war was going to bring freedom and equality to 22 million of my people, they wouldn't have to draft me. I'd join tomorrow, but I just can't shoot them for what? Every interview, every appearance, became another round in a battle larger than boxing. The turning tide. By the late 1960s, public opinion began to shift. The Vietnam War grew bloodier, less popular. Protests swelled. College campuses erupted in defiance. Ali, once condemned, now looked prophetic. His words echoed what millions began to feel. His courage inspired not only activists, but artists, musicians, and writers who carried his spirit into their work. Slowly, the villain became a voice of reason. Return to the ring. In 1970, after 3 long years of exile, Ali's license was reinstated. A courtroom ruling in Georgia allowed him to fight again. The world waited eagerly to see if the great champion still had his magic. But even as he returned to training, the Supreme Court still loomed. His conviction still stood. At any moment, his freedom could be taken away. In 1971, the case reached its climax. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously in his favor, overturning his conviction. Ali was free. It was vindication. The man who had been branded a traitor now stood tall as a man of principle. History, at last, sided with him. More than a fighter. Ali's refusal to serve in Vietnam cost him 3.5 years of his prime, millions of dollars, and the heavyweight crown. Yet in that sacrifice, he gained something far greater. The admiration of the world, the respect of generations to come. He had stood alone against a superpower and endured. From that moment on, Ali was not just a champion of boxing.
He was a champion of conscience. The larger legacy. Ali's stand against the draft changed the way athletes were seen. No longer were they expected to stay silent, to simply entertain. Ali showed that athletes could be activists, that their platform carried weight, that their choices mattered beyond the arena. His courage became a template. Decades later, when athletes spoke out against injustice, they walked a path first paved by Ali. In the end, the man who risked it all gained the one prize no title belt could offer: immortality. The fight of the century, Ali versus Frazier. The year was 1971, Madison Square Garden, New York City. The world had waited for this night. The streets outside were buzzing, cameras flashing, celebrities arriving in fur coats and fine suits. Frank Sinatra himself sat at ringside, not as a guest but as a photographer, his camera slung around his neck. That was how big the moment was. Inside the arena, the energy was electric. Two men, both undefeated. Two heavyweights, both champions in their own way. But only one could be king. This was more than a fight. This was a clash of worlds, a collision of philosophies, a duel between history and destiny. Muhammad Ali, the man who had refused the draft, the man exiled and then vindicated, the self-proclaimed greatest. Joe Frazier, the quiet warrior, the working-class hero, the man who carried the crown in Ali's absence. They called it the fight of the century, and it was. The build-up Ali's return to boxing was dramatic. After his exile, he fought Jerry Quarry in 1970 and won. Then he faced Oscar Bonavena in December, surviving a brutal test before knocking him out in the final round. But now, the real test awaited. Joe Frazier. Frazier was no ordinary champion. He was relentless, his style built on constant pressure, bobbing, weaving, hammering left hooks like thunder. He wasn't flashy. He didn't dance. He didn't boast. He came forward and broke men down. To the public, Ali and Frazier became symbols. Ali, the outspoken rebel, the man of principle. Frazier, the man of the people, the silent grinder. But the narrative was sharpened by politics. Ali called Frazier an Uncle Tom, accused him of siding with the establishment. The words cut deep, leaving scars that lasted long after the fight. For Frazier, this wasn't just about boxing. It was personal. The Garden, March 8, 1971. Madison Square Garden was filled with more than 20,000 spectators, but millions more were glued to their televisions worldwide. Every seat vibrated with tension. Ringside, stars like Frank Sinatra, Barbra Streisand, and Burt Lancaster leaned forward, eyes fixed. The crowd was divided. Chants of "Ali, Ali" clashed with chants of "Smokin' Joe." This was war. Round 1. The return. The bell rang, and the fight began. Ali came out light on his feet, dancing, jabbing, moving as though the years of exile had not touched him. His punches snapped like whips, his confidence radiated. In those opening rounds, it looked like the old Ali had returned. His jab peppered Frazier, his combinations flowed, his grin widened. The crowd roared. But Frazier did not waver. He absorbed the blows, kept coming forward, his head bobbing, weaving, his body bending. Each step was pressure, each breath was patience. He was waiting for his moment. The middle rounds. The grind by the 4th round, Ali's rhythm began to change. The long layoff showed. His legs, once endless, began to slow. His punches lacked the same snap, and Frazier smelled blood. Frazier began digging to the body. Left hook to the ribs, left hook to the liver. Over and over, pounding, relentless. Ali winced but did not show weakness. He leaned back on the ropes, tried to rope a dope years before perfecting it, but Frazier's pressure was suffocating. The garden shook with each exchange. Ali's combinations versus Frazier's hooks. Style versus will. Grace versus grit. By the 7th round, the tide was clear. Ali was still dangerous, but Frazier was relentless. His left hook found Ali's chin more than once, snapping his head back, forcing him into survival. Still, Ali would not yield. He taunted, he grinned, he whispered between clinches, "Is that all you got, Joe?" Frazier answered not with words, but with fists. Round 11. The punishment. The 11th round was brutal. Frazier landed a crushing left hook that rocked Ali's head sideways. For the first time in his career, Ali looked vulnerable, truly shaken. The crowd gasped, but Ali, with the stubborn heart of a champion, stayed upright, refusing to fall. His pride carried him through even as Frazier pressed, pounding his body, hammering his jaw. Ali's corner screamed for movement, for defense, for survival. He nodded, but his legs betrayed him. The long exile had stolen some of his magic. Round 15. The knockdown. The final round. Both men exhausted, drenched in sweat, their faces swollen, their bodies bruised. Then it happened. Joe Frazier stepped in, planted his feet, and unleashed the most famous left hook of his career. It crashed against Ali's jaw like a hammer on steel. Ali's head whipped sideways, his body crumpled. For the first time, Muhammad Ali was knocked down. The garden erupted. Ali, pride burning, refused to stay down. He rose, staggering but standing, his eyes defiant. He finished the round, battered but unbroken. When the final bell rang, both men stood in the center of the ring, warriors who had given everything. The decision. The judges announced the verdict. Joe Frazier, unanimous decision. The crowd roared, half in triumph, half in heartbreak. Ali, the once undefeated champion, had tasted his first professional loss. Frazier lifted his arms, victorious. The working-class hero had toppled the king. Aftermath. Ali, bruised and beaten, still found words. "I'm still the greatest," he said, "but Joe's the greatest tonight." Frazier, though triumphant, was carried to the hospital that night. The punishment had been mutual. His face was swollen, his body battered, but his spirit soared. He had beaten the man who had mocked him, the man who claimed invincibility. For Ali, the loss was bitter, but it was also fuel. He knew he would return. He knew this was not the end of the story. And for the world, the fight was unforgettable. It lived up to its name, the fight of the century. Not just because of skill, not just because of drama, but because it represented something deeper. It was about identity, struggle, and the price of greatness. Legacy of the fight. The Ali Frazier trilogy would go down as one of the greatest rivalries in sports history. But this first chapter was the most iconic. It was the night Ali was humanized, the night Frazier became a legend, the night boxing transcended sport and became a mirror of the times. Ali lost the battle, but the war between these two giants had only just begun. Redemption and the road to the rumble in the jungle. The story of Muhammad Ali after the first clash with Joe Frazier in 1971 is not a tale of immediate victory, but one of resilience, reflection, and the slow, steady climb back toward greatness. For many fighters, a defeat of that magnitude might have been the end. Ali, however, was not like many fighters. His loss in what the world had called the fight of the century was humbling, but not defeating. In a way, it gave him a new path to walk, one that was less about being the loud, brash young champion, and more about showing the quiet, enduring strength of a man who would not allow his story to end at Madison Square Garden. The months after the Frazier fight were strangely quiet for Ali. Gone were the celebrations, the parades, and the unbroken string of victories. Now he spent more time in contemplation. He was still only 29 years old, but in boxing terms, his years out of the ring had taken a toll. His body had changed. He was not as quick as he had once been, but he was smarter, more patient, and perhaps more willing to adapt. He would need all of those qualities in the years ahead. Imagine Ali in those days, walking in the early mornings, the streets still covered in the hush of dawn, his breath clouding in the cool air. He trained steadily, not with the wild intensity of a newcomer, but with the measured discipline of a man who had already seen the mountain's summit and wished to climb again. His trainers noticed a difference. Ali still joked and still carried himself with that easy charm, but underneath was a quiet determination. Soft ambient piano music and the faint chirping of birds might accompany this part of the story. We are no longer at the noisy height of fame, but in the quieter valley of self-discovery. By 1972, Ali was back in the ring, fighting opponents who, though talented, were not quite the giants of the sport. He faced fighters like Jerry Quarry, Floyd Patterson once more, and Bob Foster. These victories restored his rhythm, but they were also a kind of practice, steps leading back toward the highest levels of competition. Ali's style during this time evolved. He was less the perpetual dancer of his early years and more a tactician, willing to stay close, to block, to wait for openings. His mouth was still quick, but his movements had grown deliberate. Yet the real test of his redemption came in 1973, when Ali faced a man who would become both his rival and his test, Ken Norton. Norton was an unusual opponent. Strong, relentless, and unafraid of Ali's reputation, he fought with a style that disrupted Ali's rhythm. In their first meeting, Norton broke Ali's jaw. The pain was immense, and for the first time, Ali looked vulnerable in a way that unsettled even his most loyal fans. Imagine the scene. Ali sitting in his corner, his jaw swelling, the crowd murmuring in disbelief. It was another moment that might have ended a career. But Ali did not quit. He fought through all 15 rounds, enduring agony, though he lost by decision. Many said that night in San Diego showed more about Ali's spirit than some of his victories ever had. He was willing to stand in the storm, to endure pain, and to keep fighting when so much of him wanted to stop. Gentle, low drums, and the sound of a steady heartbeat might underscore this moment. Not fast, not dramatic, but a reminder of resilience. The loss to Norton, like the one to Frazier, became another stone in the foundation of Ali's redemption story. Later that same year, he faced Norton again, this time in Los Angeles. This time Ali was prepared. The fight was grueling, but Ali managed to edge out a split decision. It was not flashy, and it did not silence every critic, but it was enough. He had shown that he could adjust, that he could learn from defeat, and that he could rise again after being broken. But the world still looked for one fight above all others, a rematch with Joe Frazier. By then, Frazier himself had lost his championship to a new force in boxing, George Foreman. Foreman, younger, stronger, and devastating in his power, had destroyed Frazier in 2 brutal rounds in Kingston, Jamaica, in 1973. To many, Foreman looked unstoppable, a man who would dominate the heavyweight division for years to come. Ali's path, however, was not finished. In January of 1974, Ali and Frazier met once again, this time not for the championship, but for pride, redemption, and position. Madison Square Garden once more became the stage, and the world watched. This time, Ali fought with patience, using his jab like a painter's brush, steadily outscoring Frazier across 12 rounds. It was not the same as their first encounter. Ali's punches were sharper, his movements more controlled, his confidence returned. At the end, the decision was clear. Muhammad Ali had defeated Joe Frazier. The rematch restored much of Ali's standing. He was no longer the young champion of the 1960s, but he had proven he could still rise to the occasion. More importantly, it placed him directly on a collision course with George Foreman, the reigning heavyweight champion of the world. Foreman was seen as a force of nature. His fists seemed like hammers, his presence in the ring overwhelming. Many feared for Ali. Critics argued that at 32 years old, he was too slow, too battered by years and losses to stand against a man like Foreman. But Ali, in his own way, had been preparing for this moment all along. His defeats had taught him patience. His victories had reminded him of his strengths. And deep down he knew that the story of Muhammad Ali was not yet complete. As 1974 unfolded, plans began for what would become one of the most famous fights in history, the Rumble in the Jungle. It would not take place in New York or Las Vegas, but in Zaire, in the heart of Africa. There, Ali would face Foreman in a battle that was more than just sport. It would be a test of endurance, strategy, and the unshakable belief of a man who refused to be forgotten. Soft, distant drumming, the gentle hum of cicadas, and the suggestion of warm African night air might carry us to the edge of this next great moment. Ali's road to Zaire was not a straight line. It was paved with defeats, lessons, and quiet victories. But by the time he stepped onto that plane in 1974, the man who had once been Cassius Clay, who had become Muhammad Ali, who had been champion, exile, underdog, and rival, was ready once again to step into history. And so, Chapter 10 closes not with the fight itself, but with the anticipation of it. The long road of redemption had led Ali back to the very brink of destiny.